And that's what freaks me out about like interacting with cops. Like I have known plenty of cops. I worked directly with them, and by and large they were all good people, right? But like we have that phrase, power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely, right?
Right.
And I've worked with so many cops who were good people, but when it came to being, figures of authority and power, the second that they have that, there is a little bit of an ego trip.
This is Cross-Examined, the legal podcast for people who want to know about their rights and talk about the American justice system. I'm defense attorney Alexis Garuz, and with me today is the Michael.
Thanks so much for having me, Alexis.
Excited to have you here.
Yeah.
So we really try to bring out different perspectives. And one of the things that I think is so unique about your background and story is that you got into law enforcement work, but not from the perspective of law enforcement.
Yeah.
So tell us about that journey.
Yeah, it's weird. So like, context for anyone listening, I'm actually like one of the directors and producers of the show here at Cross-Examined. And we got to talking about my background. I was really excited to be working with you as a defense attorney. And I used to be an interrogator, which is a really edgy thing to say.
Which I never would have guessed, by the way. But I remember this coming up in conversation. I was like, that's fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a teddy bear, People hear that I was an interrogator and they start thinking all sorts of dark thoughts. I mean, we have like this perception of what an interrogator is because of, TV and movies and stuff, right? So people don't really like understand what the job actually really is, and I had no idea what I was getting myself into, but it was basically a summer job, which is hilarious to think about. I signed an NDA for the company I was contracted through and the police department who trained me, but basically the skinny of it is that I was looking for a summer job in loss prevention in a service and retail industry space. And one day I'm sitting at a tattoo parlor, getting one of my forearms done up, needles in my arm, and I get a phone call, and I see that it's from, my prospective boss. I pick it up and I did an interview over the phone. He hears the buzzing of the needle. He thinks that I'm driving my car. I'm in a tunnel or something. I'm like, I don't want to get in trouble. I don't want them to like think that, I'm some sort of like, dirtbag who has tattoos. And like, I don't know what the, you get a new job. You're, a kid. You're worried that people are going to not hire you based on, X, Y, and Z reasons. Right. So hilariously enough, I knocked that interview out of the park. They brought me in to the office and interviewed me directly, and they saw my new tattoo and they were like, did you just get that done? And I'm like, yeah, of course. I hope that's not a problem. I can cover it up. And they're like, were you getting a tattoo done while you were having your first interview? And I was like, yeah. And I guess a light bulb went off in their head because the job I was applying for wasn't the job that I got. When they found out that I hold up under pressure and can conduct myself, professionally with a tattoo gun to my skin, they asked if I was interested in investigations and interrogations. And I literally just said, I'm like 22 at the time. I go, does it pay more? They're like, it pays a little better, yeah. So I did it. They trained me. I was trained by the police department in that area for like suspect apprehension, combat, a lot lot stuff. I was maced, which
oh my gosh,
I don't.
You went through the ringer.
Yeah, I don't advise it. But yeah, and once they had me do that, I was positioned sort of covertly in the company that I was working for. Everyone assumed that I was loss prevention, but I was actually doing investigations for corporate theft and policy violations on a larger scale. So yeah, I was mostly looking out for white collar crime and people who were just stealing tens of thousands of dollars in cash assets.
That's fascinating. I mean, I think that, it's one of those types of crimes that is sexy, right? People love it. And you see these shows. And it was funny because I just watched a movie on Netflix about these women that were doing this like coupon fraud scheme.
Okay.
I don't know if you saw this.
No, I don't even. Who's in it?
It was really good. I'm blanking now, but I can see Kristen Bell.
Really?
Yeah, it was
Okay.
super good. And Vince Vaughn. Yeah,
Really?
who plays a postal inspector.
Love it.
And it was these based loosely off of a true story of two women, I think in Arizona, that just started this. They were extreme couponers, and it evolved into, how can we go to this source and like basically get all these free coupons? And they started a website and they were selling them to people.
Yeah.
And like it evolved into this huge thing where, you know, the companies started getting upset because they were losing so much money based on these fraudulent coupons. And so it's just funny because I think a lot of those, well, I think it's interesting for two reasons, right? Like a lot of financial crimes, especially ones involving big companies, I think the general public looks at that in a very Robin Hood-esque type way. Like people don't, I think, view financial crimes, depending on who the victim actually is, in the same way that they do if you were to steal an old lady's purse, right? It's a completely different dynamic.
Right. Stealing from rich people is not the same as stealing from poor people, right?
Yeah, I think socially people view that in a very different light. And so that's why you can make movies about it. And it's still a feel-good movie, even though someone goes to prison. So yeah, I mean, that's fascinating. I want to know a little bit more about how you learned the interrogation process, because there is a lot of stuff related to that there is a method to it, and there's ways of getting information that people are oblivious to. I have a lot of folks call that'll say, well, the police called, they wanted to talk to my son because my son is apparently involved in something. And so I said, sure, I'll march my kid right down to the police station and we'll have this conversation. And a lot of times I don't think people are doing it because I think people are doing it because they think they can handle it, right?
Yeah.
Like they assume that they can go in and just kind of explain things and leave unscathed, even if it's a situation where maybe they didn't do anything wrong. And then it very quickly usually escalates into something where people are in way over their heads.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I'm just curious to know, like, how did you learn those kinds of techniques, especially from somebody who didn't go through the police academy, didn't go through that specific type of training, although it sounds like you kind of did aspects of that. What was that like for you, and what are some insights from that?
Yeah. So, I mean, I was in art school at the time. I was, I'm a filmmaker, I'm a photographer, I work with actors on a regular basis. And going through film school, I was working with a lot of like amateur actors and professional actors. Sure. And I've always had like a knack for reading body language and picking up on a good performance versus a bad performance. And like, there's trickiness to that too, right? Because like people behave different ways, when they're stressed out, or when they're trying to like put up a front. My boss at the time thought that it was a skill of mine, that I was like a director working with actors and that I could read body language. And a lot of it came down to reading body language. They literally teach you things like, sure. Crossed arm posture is a guarded posture. Open arm posture is inviting, right? Someone who's sitting with their arms crossed doesn't want to be there, whereas someone who's sitting like this, is a little bit more comfortable and confident. I was a fat kid growing up, and I used to sit like this all the time just to try and cover my gut. So like there's, only so much credibility that you can give to stuff like that. But, it's all contextual, right? I see someone sitting across the table from me, bouncing their leg, arms crossed, not making eye contact with me. Well, they might be a teenager who just stole something, or they might be a kid with an attitude who doesn't like authority and just doesn't want to be there, right? So really what it comes down to, and this is where it's fun. So like, we would refer to ourselves as interviewers, not interrogators.
Oh, of course.
Right? Because you don't want to intimidate anyone. I was working in Illinois at the time, and nothing that's given up to you in terms of a statement under duress or anything that can qualify as duress is admissible in court, right?
Sure.
So like, I have tattoos. It's hot in this interrogation room. If I roll up my sleeves just to like air out my arms and sit like this, that's an act of intimidation.
Wow, the standard must be much lower in Illinois then, because I cannot imagine a situation where somebody rolling up their sleeves would constitute like an involuntary confession, but that's wild.
And that's exactly the kind of stuff that we were dealing with was, in Illinois at the time, I don't know if this is still true today because I'm so far removed from the justice system and all that. Again, it was just a summer job. It was a great story to tell at parties, especially for a 22-year-old in college surrounded by girls who want to date a badass. But like, that's not who I am. It's not what I do. I learned a few things. I have a few fun stories. But in reality, you're in this room with these people who did things that were either wrong or just questionable, and you can't tell them what you know, right? Like, we investigate them. We have them on camera. We have security cameras that they're aware of. We have security cameras that they're not aware of. In Illinois, you can't record someone's audio. You can't record their voice without their consent, Okay. So like in the interrogation room, we have these cameras up. It's a pinhole camera in a wall somewhere. They can see everything. They can't hear anything. So if I'm subpoenaed to go to court because one of my cases went to trial and I show up on camera rolling up my sleeves and suspect starts acting nervous.
They don't know what happened.
They don't know what I said. They don't know what I did, besides what they're looking at on camera.
That makes more sense.
Right? So it's iffy in that regard, and there's like a lot of stuff that you have to step around. So what the interrogation, heavy air quotes for people who can't see my fingers doing this, what it comes down to is sort of just heavily implying that you know things that you may not know, following an investigation that you may have not completed, right? Really what my job came down to was if I had a case where I recorded someone committing certain acts on camera repeatedly over a period of time, it was almost never the case that someone would do something one time unless I saw them literally pocketing a fistful of cash.
Sure.
That they would get pulled into the interrogation room right then and there, right? We would build a case, we would review it, it would have to get approved by my supervisors, and then we would pull them, right? And from there, it's literally just sitting down with them, and it's that notorious question that, cops will ask you when you get pulled over, right? Like, do you know why I pulled you over?
Yeah.
Do you know why you're sitting across the table from me today?
So I want to go back to what you said because it was interesting, right? Like having a conversation about evidence you may or may not have and, what you may or may not know, right? And going into it with that flavor. I mean, one of the things that I tell people regularly is that if the police are looking to sit down and talk to you, they probably have everything they need. They're looking for the bow that packages everything together nicely, which is your confession. Because they're not going to get anything from you that's going to help you. I mean, they already have all this information in the background. And realistically, and I don't know what it's like in Illinois, but I know that, police can lie to you. I mean, they can mislead you, talk about things that they don't have, right? And all of that, pressure when somebody's sitting in a room and talking to somebody, it plays a factor. And
well, you're trying to get them to incriminate themselves.
Yeah.
Right? You want them to do all the work for you.
Right.
So that you're not forced to pull it out of them, right? And that's what people want an interrogator to do. They want you to waterboard them. They want you to peel their fingernails back. They want you to do all that badass shit that you see Jason Statham doing in a movie,
right.
Because that's what an interrogator is to people, right? So like when they get pulled into a room and they hear that, you're an interrogator, they're already intimidated, right?
Yeah.
And by and large, working in the service industry, like I was positioned with loss prevention, so I was forced to review cases that weren't part of my main objective of doing corporate theft investigations,
Sure.
right? So like I would get literal teenagers coming in, just working their summer jobs, sitting down across the table from me, scared shitless that they're not that they're going to go to jail, but that their parents are going to be mad at them,
Sure.
That they're going to lose their job and that their
Yeah.
parents are going to kick their asses, like that's a completely different ballpark. Like, again, a kid can have an attitude issue, but more often than not, like they have no idea what's going on.
Right.
And they're carrying a guilty conscience like no one else, right? Like
Right.
you might find like a little sociopath running around who just thinks they can get away with lying about anything. And he might. Like the experience that I've had, I can confidently say that you're better off denying any accusation that's given to you and hoping for the best, because my job was largely testing the waters to see if someone's going to give up more information than we actually have on them, right? Like the difference between a felony and just a misdemeanor is a few bucks, you know? So if they're not confessing to a certain amount that we don't have on record that we can't quantify, they might get away just fine. You know, they're going to lose their job, but they're not going to go to jail. The second that they broached that $500 mark, which suddenly became a felony, I've got the police in the other room ready to cuff you and take you in. You know, and then you can call your parents from jail, like from holding. It's, you know, it's this whole thing where like I oftentimes like you feel cool when you get someone who's actually doing something wrong. Right. You know, but when you get like a nervous kid, who just starts trying to tell you what they think you want to hear because they think that you'll go softer on them if they're perceived as honest, right? And that's what freaks me out about like interacting with cops. Like I have known plenty of cops. I worked directly with them, and by and large they were all good people, right? But like we have that phrase, power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely, right? And I've worked with so many cops who were good people, but when it came to being, you know, figures of authority and power, the second that they have that, there is a little bit of an ego trip, right?
There's a power dynamic that I think is even when you have police officers that are friendly, that are nice people, that are, you know, engaged with the community, there's still a power dynamic that is the backdrop of any interaction. And so, you know, I've often heard people say, well, why would you be nervous around the police if you haven't done anything wrong? And it's like, there's something innate about it, I think.
And they're trained to be intimidating.
Correct. And I think that, like, you know, one of the things I've said often is that policing has changed in a lot of ways. And I think depending on who you talk to, they will have a completely different concept of policing. I mean, I think that, you know, suburban white people by and large have a very different, you know, view of the police in terms of what their role is. You know, are they here to help me? You know, they're here to keep us safe, all that stuff, versus, you know, black and brown people in, you know, in like a heavily urban area. I mean,
well,
like,
that's
it's
other
totally
thing.
Different, right?
Yeah.
But I also think, right, with that even as policing has changed since, you know, we could go down a whole rabbit hole about all the inception of policing and all of that stuff. But I'll say this, right? So like, there definitely used to be a time where, like, let's say you had a little too much to drink, you got pulled over. They might be like, hey, let's just get you home.
A slap on the wrist.
Right.
Yeah.
They might have done that. There was, I think, more discretion in terms of how to deal with certain interactions. And I think that culture, you know, when I think back to like how my grandparents, who are no longer here, but how they would talk about police, right, in rural Wisconsin, that's a very different dynamic than what you see all over social media now. And I have to say, it's now becoming more visible, I think, because this stuff is also happening to white people. People don't like to talk about that, but when it starts happening to white people visibly, then people get really upset.
Well, it's 1,000% true, though.
I mean, it just is that dynamic.
And I mean, it's an issue across just systems of power and power dynamics on all levels, right? Like, the most obvious one is like the police versus the civilian, right? Like, and like we can talk about racial constructs and all that stuff. But when I was in interrogations and doing, you know, I mean, investigations for these theft cases,
right,
I can tell you right now, and you know, I signed an NDA. I'm not going to say who I was working for or where I was working, but I can tell you without lying even a little bit that I was objectively trained to racially profile people, because from their perspective, it was statistically more likely that people coming from certain areas to work this job were more likely to be stealing.
Sure.
Right? I literally had an interrogation with a kid who was 17, 18 sitting across the table from me, who the first thing he said was, I bet you see a lot of black people sitting across this table from you.
Wow. That's
the first thing he said, you know? And I didn't say anything back to him, but the objective truth was that we were literally trained to look at things that way. So the question becomes then, am I looking for it and seeing it more often there because I'm trained to look for it in those specific areas? I mean, the statistic used to be that like the number one shoplifter in America was a middle-aged white woman.
Yeah.
but we weren't trained to look for middle-aged white women.
Right.
Who were guaranteed still stealing shit.
Yeah.
So, I mean, the issue of those power dynamics, I saw things happen to fellow coworkers, whether they were women or whether they were white men like myself, who were being also harassed in certain ways that I just couldn't abide. And then, it's like, okay, well, that's just me, right?
Sure.
But like you said, now you see this stuff happening to people. I mean, thanks to social media, body cams, all this stuff, it's becoming more obvious that it's a systemic issue with how we are training our authority figures, right? Like,
and you hate to say that it's gotten to that point, but I also think that, like, again, America by and large, like, you need to have, we're so fractured on a lot of political lines, right?
Yeah.
We're fractured culturally for a lot of reasons, but I think, it becomes more visible when you have people that are in, positions of power or authority, or just being able to have more weight in terms of what they're saying, right? Because, like, if you see, some random white family that has suffered a terrible case of police brutality, right?
Yeah.
Like, that hits home for a different community in a different way. And I think it's unfortunate that is something that has to be visible to move the dial to say there's something not right with how we're approaching policing. But I mean, again, it's hard to not see it. I mean, I will say there have been many cases where I've had situations where, clients acted like assholes, right? And you're looking at this body camera and you're like, okay, this officer is being so kind and patient, and they are honestly doing everything that, like, they are giving this person, like, the nicest treatment under the circumstances.
Yeah.
But there's also other situations where, despite the fact that body camera is on, you'd be shocked what they say into these hot mics. Like, that's wild, right? That it's something where they know they're being recorded, and this is still what they'll say. How much more, are they saying things or acting in a certain way when they're not being recorded? Like, that's something that everybody should care about.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I think is so good about social media, and there's a lot of pros and cons of how it, functions in our society, but I think one of the most important things is provided a channel for those instances to become widely accessible and also widely shared.
Yeah.
Because prior to that, I mean, people wouldn't necessarily believe, or would be hesitant to believe, that something happened this way, absent literally being able to see it with their own eyes.
Yeah, I mean, and it's interesting that you bring up the way people behave when they have their body cams on, right? Or like what they'll say into that hot mic, because there was an instance where I was in sort of like my investigation chamber when I was doing the interrogations thing, and I had like 50 monitors up at any given time, watching the entire facility on like 100 different screens, and the team was broken into divisions. We had internal investigations, we had external investigations, we had like loss prevention agents who were responsible for like preventing like shoplifting and dealing with that kind of thing, right? And these were by and large like your cop wannabes or former police.
Sure.
Right. And again, interpersonally, all great guys, but these are people who are also positioned in a place of authority, who are expected to behave a certain way internally for the benefit of making sure that they're running good interference with bad people, right? Or people who are just doing bad things, right? And so I was always very concerned when I would see them acting out in certain ways behind closed doors and making certain comments about certain kinds of people, or looking over at my monitors and like pointing out a person of color and like saying certain things. Like, and these weren't exclusively white agents, right? Like, we had a very diverse crew, and they were all saying very similar things. It got to a point where they were all horsing around, grab-assing, misbehaving just in the office, and it was interfering with my work, it was interfering with the integrity of their work. it came to a point where I was so frustrated that I literally pulled out my camera on my phone and held it. This is before, like, the social media boom.
Right.
But we still had Facebook, we still had YouTube, we still had all that stuff. And this was long before like the normalization of like body cams and stuff.
Right.
So I pulled out my camera and suddenly they all stopped and they all got very uncomfortable. And I had to make the point. I was like, why do you feel comfortable behaving this way when the camera's not rolling?
This has reminded me of a story that was such a weird interaction. So I took some time off between undergrad and law school, so I wasn't going straight away. And right before I started law school, before I even had any concept that I wanted to do criminal defense work, I was actually dating a Milwaukee police officer at the time. And I remember one instance where he came home and was talking to me about what had happened during that particular day. And he was recalling a story about a suspect that they, I think, had to like chase. And I don't recall if it was him specifically pursuing this individual or somebody else. But like the guy basically like was running down the stairs, like tripped, fell, knocked all his teeth out. And they were like laughing hysterically about this. Like God. In a way that like, the way that they would talk about homeless people, the way that they would talk about things. And I'm thinking to myself, because I was young. I was maybe like 24 years old at the time. So like I didn't feel comfortable saying something, but I definitely felt uncomfortable, even not knowing what the trajectory of my career was. It just felt unnerving to me that people in that position were talking about people that way. And I get it. It's a hard job. I think, in hindsight, looking back, knowing what I know about the job that I do, it is a tough job. And I certainly recognize that there are aspects of that job that are, filled with all kinds of issues that can lead to like compassion fatigue. But there are also some individuals that get into it to be assholes. Yeah. And that is not, when that's left unchecked, it poisons that system. And so, the other caveat of that I will say is it was always do as I do, but do as I say, but not as I do.
Right.
Right.
I mean, that's
so
a huge
when I get
mentality.
into trouble, I should get a pass.
Yeah.
Yeah. Because, that's a huge thing. Hey, whatever.
Yeah. And I want to clarify, like, I worked with cops who I like legitimately admire, who were really good dudes, especially like absolutely. In my experience, like canine unit cops like are like really like likable guys, at least where I was working. And that makes it really tricky to have conversations about just like the systemic issues, right? Because like everyone knows a cop to some degree, right? Like I don't know someone who doesn't know a cop, right? And they're people.
Yeah.
But the second that they're like going into the line of work and they're on duty, they kind of stop acting like people. I noticed a thing where, there's a persona that a lot of them put on. And I get it. It's dangerous. It's scary. You have to, I affect right now, as we're doing this podcast, I'm affecting a persona to some degree for the benefit of this performance, right? Like every job, you work in customer service, you put on a smile, right? Like, you work construction, you act gruff and tough, despite the fact that we all have feelings and mental health issues, like you work law enforcement, you're putting yourself in the line of fire. There are dangerous situations. You have to steel yourself, right? But I guess my question then becomes, and maybe you have some insight into this, but like, where do we draw the line between stealing yourself and being an asshole, right? Like, because there are situations in which it is a complicated environment to be in, and there are circumstances in which like the police lives may be legitimately in jeopardy.
Absolutely.
Right? I mean, the discourse is by and large like, blue lives aren't a real thing, right? Like you choose to be a cop. It's not the color of your skin. You can't, take off brown person's skin at the end of the day and stop being brown. You can stop being a cop if you choose to. Regardless, you have to do a job. We live in a society, right? Like society has rules. These rules are created by people, but at the end of the day, they're people who we voted on being in power, right?
Right.
Hopefully, in most cases. And these cops, their job at face value is to just maintain peace and order, right? But like, I don't know, do you think that there is a line between being an asshole and just being a stern authority figure?
I don't know. I mean, I think so much of it boils down to like, what are we as a community wanting to spend our resources on? Like, absolutely. Like, there is dangerous crime that is concerning to everybody in the community. And it's not just an issue of, you know, depending on where you live, right? Like, it affects everybody in society. So there's absolutely like a legitimate need for police. I am not of the camp that we should abolish the police.
Right.
I'll just
No,
say
of course.
that candidly.
Yeah.
But I also think that when you look at programs that have been implemented, not necessarily just in other places, but even how things were budgeted in past times, you might have had other resources diverted to, for example, like mental health crisis stuff in tandem with policing, right? So I think there's ways to use collaborative approaches to deal with some of these situations that, for example, maybe the police don't necessarily need to be involved in their law enforcement capacity, and there's something else that can be done, but clearly there needs to be some sort of intervention. How can we not escalate this into, you know, a situation where somebody is now dealing with another criminal case that really is stemming from behavior that shouldn't necessarily be criminalized?
Well, what's your
right?
position on like social worker intervention then? Because I have friends who do social work for people who are like mentally ill, who are impoverished, you know, and by and large, it is like a mental health issue when you're looking at cases of like, you know, the unhoused and belligerents in public, or, you know, some drunk guy who's stumbling around, or an addict stumbling around making a scene, you know, where a cop intervening, you know, can escalate things to a degree where someone's getting hurt, someone's getting potentially killed. Like, the cops feel threatened, so they deal with the way they're trained to deal with it. Right. So like, I mean, where do you think that the role of a social worker or something to that degree comes into play?
Well, I know some departments do work with like a social worker to try to, and again, I think it's to some extent a drop in the bucket, right? Because there's a lot of need, and, you know, the resources are only so much, right? But I do think that, and this kind of reminds me of a particular situation that, you know, it's just interesting, right? Like, I've dealt with a lot of clients that have had like Chapter 51 issues in tandem with criminal cases.
What's Chapter 51?
Chapter 51 is like an emergency detention that's usually based on like a psychiatric issue. Okay. Somebody will say, you know, my parent, my kid, somebody is having a crisis. I need the police to get involved, and they'll put them on kind of a temporary hold, and then they may go through a civil process to determine, okay, what are we going to do here? And a lot of times for most people, once they're stabilized, it's comply with these rules, and then, you know, we'll kind of deal with it, comply with your treatment, whatever. Okay. It's not something that, for example, you can't like look it up on CCAP, right? So you can't necessarily know. But what happens is, and what is so frustrating, I've seen this over the years many times, is you'll have somebody in a moment of crisis, clearly having a mental health crisis. I mean, in fact, they're often taken to, you know, a hospital, and then subsequently, you know, perhaps to like, there's a hospital in Winnebago, and there's another one that I'm blanking on, right? So during that process, right, police are involved, and sometimes people are aggressive and belligerent with police, or they might say something, and this is what really frustrates me. They might say something like, you know, of course they're going to be, you know, profane or like pissed because they, you know, sometimes have no idea what's going on, or they're frustrated, whatever, right? So a lot of times you'll get like threats to law enforcement cases, right? Which are felony cases, because somebody said something. Clearly it was something that was said in a moment of crisis, but, you know, we're now talking about, well, that hurt someone's feelings. And like that as a response, and it's not just the police, right? So the police, in terms of charging, let's back it up, right? So police make a referral to a district attorney's office. That means they present what they want to be charged to the district attorney's office for review. Okay. So police don't determine in and of themselves what someone's ultimately going to be charged with. That's with the discretion of the DA's office. But
is that for all cases?
At least in Wisconsin. I mean, I guess I'm not totally sure how like other states work, so I won't, you know, go beyond what I know, but here, you know, police will conduct an investigation. They'll make a recommendation for charges. They call it a referral, right? And then somebody at the DA's office that's an attorney will look it over and say, here's what I want to charge based off of this circumstance. And with that is prosecutorial discretion, right? Like they can choose, hey, do I want to charge everything I could charge? Or do I want to maybe think about this, meet you somewhere in the middle, like, or if I think I can't prove it, do I process it, right? So a lot of thought that, goes into it that is all happening behind the scenes before it even gets to court. So a lot of people don't even know how this process unfolds. But that's where it comes down to, what are the decisions that if we know somebody's, being taken in to the hospital for a mental health crisis, and this is the conduct that stems from it. And I'm not talking about situations where people get hurt, but even then, right? Like there still may be circumstances where when we're talking about the intent component, that's just not there. And so, there are different ways of, one, evaluating competency, right? So competency is totally different from what people consider like an insanity defense. We don't call it that anymore. We call it N.G.I, which is short for not guilty by reason of insanity. We call it now mental disease or defect. But what essentially both of those aspects are designed to address is, one, is somebody able to understand and meaningfully participate in their defense? That's competency, right? Like who's the judge, who's your lawyer? And that seems very basic and rudimentary. However, the meaningfully assist in their defense piece is the one that I've always argued and pushed for so much harder, because there are a lot of circumstances where people may know who the players are at the table. They understand what's going on, but they are not at all able to engage in a way that's helpful for them to be able to like work on their case with their lawyer, right? And so that is a determination that after a doctor does a review, the court actually makes a judicial determination whether or not someone's competent. That's usually based on that doctor's recommendation, but that's how it goes. N.G.I is a similar route, but that is more so to say, at the time of the offense, was somebody able to conform their conduct to what the law requires based on something going on from a mental health standpoint. So different, right? And sometimes people think, well, if you go down that road, it's super easy. Not necessarily. I mean, even if you get what's called conditional release, you're getting basically probation, but also like enforced mental health care. Now, it's not necessarily like a medication order in all circumstances,
sure,
but it's not a cakewalk in terms of being on probation, right? And for some people, they actually get committed to a hospital because
well, and that's what I was going to ask, right? Because like there used to be like this weird like trope in like movies and media, and like people used to think that like you could just like plead insanity, right, or temporary insanity, but in my understanding, like jail's a better place half the time than like getting committed, being force-fed pills. Like, I mean, I don't want to like make broad assumptions and like, there's different circumstances and stuff, but like how does someone, I mean, I guess what criteria are used to establish like a plea of not guilty by insanity,
Yeah, so it's interesting because you would still have like a doctor's evaluation, but I guess before you even get to that point, it's the client's decision whether or not they want to pursue an N.G.I plea.
Sure.
It's not my decision. And so a lot of times when people want to talk about that, and I'll say this too, just because you have a diagnosed mental illness does not mean you automatically will be able to support an N.G.I plea.
Sure.
A lot of times people think, well, because I have a certain diagnosis, shouldn't I be able to use this defense? Like, no.
Well, what happens if you advise them to take that plea, but they're not in like a mental state to make a sound decision for themselves? Like if they're like, no, I'm sane, like, and that's coming from a place of not being well.
So that probably sounds like an intersection of a competency issue as well, which is something that defense lawyers have an obligation to raise if we think that there's a competency issue with our client, right, at any point in time in the case. So that being said, I would imagine in a circumstance like that, it probably would be something where competency would be addressed first, because it may be a situation where that person is not able to meaningfully assist in their own defense, right?
Sure.
And so from that perspective, once there's a determination that somebody is not competent, everything's kind of put on pause, right, for a period of time. That a couple things could happen, right? One, we try to treat them to competency within the statutory time limit, okay? And that depends on the type of case that it is. If they can do that successfully, sometimes through just counseling, Other times through medication. It just depends. If we can do that, great. Then we get to that point. There's another review. Okay, this person's competent. We can continue the case, right? If not, then things don't really ever progress, right? And so that's when we talk about whether or not things get converted to a Chapter 51. Does your case get dismissed? What happens? In those situations, it is usually for people that have either something that is very persistent and just unsuccessfully treated, or something that has more to do with a cognitive issue that just will not improve with treatment. But yeah, I mean, those would be things where if that's a concern, that's probably the bigger issue that has to be dealt with up front. But yeah, it does involve getting usually a forensic psychologist or psychiatrist to do an examination, and their evaluation is really aimed at trying to see whether or not whatever's going on with that person can support that N.G.I plea. And then the parties get the reports, and then we go to court and try to figure out if we're going to stipulate or agree to that finding. If not, there's basically a trial that happens in two parts. The first part is a person guilty or not, right? If they're not guilty, then it's over, right? If they are found guilty, there's a second portion, and that is, okay, are they N.G.I, right? So should they not be legally responsible for it because of that particular mental health issue that was existing at the time? So yeah, it is a complicated area.
So what does that mean though? Like I'm curious. Like they get the N.G.I. We're determining that they're not legally responsible.
Correct.
But they still have to undergo treatment, like court-appointed treatment. Like, how does that work? Because like something's happened, right? We don't know what, hypothetically, just like something's happened that, could be wrong, but through no fault of their own because of, a successful N.G.I plea, right? So what happens then, like in the legal system?
So then different, I guess you would say, agencies that get involved. So Department of Corrections, like Health and Human Services, different kinds of the prosecutor, the defense attorney, everybody kind of gets, they'll review recommendations, basically. They'll put together like a plan. And I should say that like the attorneys aren't really involved in putting together a plan, but we kind of look at what the plan is, right? And whether or not it's a situation that the court needs to put somebody in a facility, or if it's safe for them to have that conditional release plan. That is what would happen in lieu of like prison, for example. So that is really kind of, and the cases that I've done that have gone that way, it's a very detailed thing, because they want to know, like, what are you doing? And there's a whole host of things associated with that. It's not a slap on the wrist. I mean, there are other, civil consequences that implicate, civil liberties and other things like that you do lose on account of that particular outcome. But I think for people that very much need that treatment, it's better than prison, right? But I think to what you said earlier, for people that are maybe just kind of throwing it out there that, hey, like, I have some issue going on, like, I want to pursue this, I'm like, you probably don't, and here's why. Because this actually is pretty restrictive on your freedom and your ability to do all this stuff. Like, it's one thing if that's an issue, and you can always bring up mental health and those kinds of things as like a mitigating factor, right? That's certainly something that, courts can be receptive to depending on the circumstances. But, if it's a situation where we can resolve this with an outcome that avoids all of that, then I would say, you have to think about the cost benefit for wanting to pursue something like that.
Yeah.
Because sometimes, I mean, again, it's not a slap on the wrist. It's not like you're just out and about. And I think that's the perception of society when you see like a newspaper article that says, oh, this person, was found not guilty by reason of mental disease or defect. So they think they're getting off scot-free. And that is not the case. That's not the case at all.
So I'm going to ask you, like, I guess a two-parter question that sort of has a little bit to do with this, but like getting back to the interrogations thing, I would like to remind the audience that I was a very cool, very handsome interrogator. I am single, so look me up online.
I think you might want to do this when we have a bigger follower base, but like.
But when I was doing interrogations, the reason why I left the job, I don't know how we're doing for time, but I think that clock is dead, but it's fine. Oh, sweet. Okay. Yeah. So we should consider slowly wrapping up. But, when I was doing the interrogations thing, the reason why I ultimately quit was largely for ethical reasons.
Sure.
And what it came down to was in my second year that I was there, we had a new supervisor. And our new supervisor was hell-bent on making sure that we set records for the company to have the most cases closed in a fiscal year. My job, to reiterate, was to close high-value cases revolving around corporate theft, embezzlement, policy violations, not number of cases closed, but making sure that the people who were in power and in charge and managing people weren't exploiting their authority, right? For personal gain.
Right.
We were given a quota of cases closed. Now, I grew up with paranoid parents who used to joke about how at the end of the month you have to make sure that you're 5 below the speed limit when you're driving your car, because cops are trying to close out their quotas for that month. And like that was just like a joke, right?
Right.
But like I have been driving a car for 17 plus years at this point, and I have noticed, and it might be circumstantial, it might be anecdotal, it might just be pure coincidence, but like I have noticed that like cops are out and about towards the end of the month on the highway, and I don't know why that is, and I'm not going to say the word quota or suggest that that's actively a thing that goes on, but I do know that from personal experience in my field where I was at, we were given literal orders to start closing cases of any value just to have the paperwork that says we closed this many cases in a given quarter, right? And what that led to was doubling down on discriminatory behavior.
Sure.
And leaning into those biases that we were trained on, because those were almost a surefire way to lock down a closed case for any number of reasons, right? It could have been a policy violation. It could have been a cash theft. It could have been shoplifting. It could have been anything.
But something relatively low.
But something relatively low, right? But like we were still ultimately causing like, problems for these. I mean, okay, yes, they were objectively taking things that did not belong to them, right? Or doing things that they shouldn't have been doing. Part of my job was like reviewing like sexual harassment cases, and like drug policy violations. We never had someone fired because they were positive for a THC drug test, but we did have non-negatives, which is very fun language to use. But we were closing cases left and right? And it was for people who we were taught to have biases against just to close those things. Meanwhile, I know for a fact that there were larger, more important cases happening with larger thefts, larger policy violations, bigger problems happening right under our noses that we weren't actively investigating because of this quota we were given. Now, my question for you, whether you have any insight into this or not, is do you think that there is some legitimacy to the idea of a police quota, not just for speeding or any of that stuff, but for cases closed? Do you think that there is an issue that might be there underlying in our system? And do you think that that might have something to do with any sort of discriminatory behavior for the benefit of closing cases? That's just something that I've dealt with on a very anecdotal level. I'm not trying to suggest that that's a real thing. Yeah. But like we do live in a system where like power is exploited, and like we do see issues of race dynamics and these things happening more prevalently than it happens to white people, right? And like that could just be an issue of systemic racism, but I'm just wondering, like, do you think in your experience that there might be something to the idea that there is a quota and cases need to get closed for the benefit, because it's a job at the end of the day, right?
Right. Yeah. I mean, I don't know. I'm not confident saying that I think that exists, but what I do think, right, and I say this because like I don't know enough about the intricacies of policing, right, from the inside. I know what I see, and I know that there's enough going on that I'm never going to be without work. So there's obviously things going on, and reviewing video after video, it seems that people's constitutional rights are still being violated. So that being said, I know that those things happen, right? What I think it comes down to in some respects is what communities choose to focus on. And that is largely politically driven, right? Because, for example, you may have, I'll give you a local example. So Waukesha County, immediately to the west of Milwaukee County, 25 minutes, right? From maybe Waukesha proper to downtown. You might get a weed ticket in Milwaukee County, right? But you might be charged criminally in Waukesha. And the dynamic is totally different. It could be the same amount, could be very similar, right? And those two counties choose to handle those things very differently, right? And that applies beyond just, weed and like low level, what we would call like, low level misdemeanors, nothing major, right? I think to some extent that comes from the fact that Milwaukee has different things to triage because they are a bigger county in terms of people, right? And they have bigger fish to fry, quite honestly. So maybe part of it is that aspect, right? Waukesha is very much a law and order type community, and I have lived there my whole life for the most part. And I don't agree with how they choose to triage things, because I think at the end of the day, it may surprise folks that, look at it from kind of a cost benefit analysis, that it's actually quite expensive to handle all of these things that are not as big of a deal in terms of public safety or those kinds of things, especially when we're talking about like weed, which is a whole nother story, because quite honestly, we are being surrounded by all these other states who
every
decided
single
we
state
want
around
the tax
us
money. We want to be able to do stuff with this.
It's that damn tavern league.
Yeah, that's a whole episode in and of itself. But yeah, I mean, so I think that how counties choose to prioritize what they want to enforce dramatically differs. And of course there's going to be bias in that. Of course there's going to be something political in that. I mean, that I think is really the driving force. I couldn't tell you if there's actual like internal metrics involved of, hey, we got to hit this number of cases. But I do think that those priorities really shape that. And I think what's unfortunate about it is, the disparate treatment that you have if you're going 20 minutes in either direction. It just doesn't make a lot of sense. But these are the things that I think, what I would really love to see is much more discourse, come election season and all those things, about local politics and about local, elections for district attorney and those kinds of things, right? Sheriff, like all of those things that prioritize or that talk about in a more transparent way, what are we prioritizing here as a community? Because we can talk about law and order, we can talk about safety and public safety and what that means. But unless we're talking about like, what do you do to accomplish those goals, or what does that mean? I think there's a real disconnect between things that actually produce those results and are good for the people of our community and like just a catchy slogan that feels good, So that's my 2 cents on that.
Yeah.
I don't know.
I love that. I love that.
That's it for this episode. As always, be sure to hit those like and subscribe buttons. Hit us up with your legal stories and questions in the comments below. And be sure to rate and review us on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. For more content like this, follow me, Alexis Garuz, on YouTube, TikTok, and Instagram. Thanks for listening to Cross Examined.